All right, Mike. Thank you so much for being here. You've been on our list for so long. We went through the living school. Your voice has been in our heads for a year. We have found truly so much insight from you, so much value from the things that you've shared. We feel your love like radiating through that project and through the content that the CAC has developed. So it's just truly an honor. Thank you for being here.
Oh my gosh, it's so great to be here. I'm shocked and honored that you would ask. I'm used to asking questions, not answering them. So this is fun.
Well, thanks, Mike. I thought maybe a good place to start would be to just have you maybe introduce a little bit about your own spiritual journey. So many things that you have shared that we've heard resonated with our own journeys, and it's a little bit different, obviously, coming from a different spiritual tradition. So, if you wouldn't mind, just like maybe introducing yourself in that way, all the way from your roots to where you find yourself now.
Yeah. Okay. What a generous question. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I will do my best because
Okay.
it's been a wild road these last 48 years.
Yeah.
So I grew up in what is probably best referred to as the Pentecostal, charismatic, evangelical word of faith movement. And so there's a lot of evangelical celebrity preachers who are sort of showing up in politics and whatnot right now. The genesis of that movement also happens to be my childhood. Uh,
Wow.
and so my dad was an associate pastor at a very, very big mega church in the New York, New Jersey area, which I gotta say was like a very cool way to grow up because I was exposed to a lot of different folks from a lot of different types of cultures and backgrounds. And that part of it I really, really loved. And then when I was about 11 or 12, my dad branched out to start his own sort of prosperity gospel style church. And, you know, by the time I was in my early 20s, my dad, my mom, myself, and my brother were all ordained clergy in that tradition. So only my sister was smart enough not to be a pastor, but the rest of us all were. Um, and the thing that's most interesting about that is that, the prosperity gospel at its heart teaches that if you have faith and if you serve God and if you believe hard enough, you will be healthy and wealthy and protected. And the short version of a very, very long story is that as I was growing up, I didn't necessarily see that reflected in the lives of the people that we served in our congregations. I saw really, really good people praying to be healed of sickness and disease and not getting better. I saw people that I don't want to call anyone a bad person, but folks that I was a little bit skeptical of, succeeding and becoming very, very wealthy by means that I didn't necessarily trust. And then
Mhm.
folks were assuming they had the blessing of God. And then really close real world experiences. When I was in third grade, one of my classmates died from a brain tumor, which was probably my first close touch with death. One of my best friends in the world died in a rock climbing accident when I was a freshman in college. And then just to sort of jump ahead, um, to the most devastating punchline of all time, by the time I was in my late 20s, um, I had married my college sweetheart. And I remember we went through pre-marriage counseling, and the pre-marriage counselor told us that in 20 years of counseling, he'd never counseled a couple that was so ready to be married. And we lasted about a year because of very, very dramatic things in the background that left me feeling very deeply betrayed by this person and kind of by God, to be honest, because I thought I'd done everything right. Just a few years after that, my dad unfortunately had a sort of a very public affair and a scandal that blew up the congregation that he was a part of, that he was leading, and blew up he and my mom's marriage. Just a few years after that, my brother took his life because of a struggle with depression and mental illness that had been going on for years. And merely 6 months after that, my mom passed away from a brain tumor. And we had about 3 weeks' notice that this was going to happen. She checked into the ER with a migraine. And I got a call the next morning that said, if you want to talk to your mom again, you need to get home today. So not to start off on a massive downer, But my life was a crash course in the reality that praying hard and doing the right thing does not necessarily guarantee that you're not going to have suffering in your life. In fact, one of our teachers here at the Living School has a saying which has become my life mantra. It's like carve it on my heart kind of truth. When he says, if we're absolutely grounded in the absolute love of God that protects us from nothing, but sustains us in all things, then we can touch the hurting places in others and in ourselves with love. And this eventually was the spirituality that I grew into, that God was not going to protect me, but I would be sustained, and that there was a love that I could drill down into that would carry me in my own brokenness and let me be there for other folks. But it was a rough road getting there, you know? So that kind of was my, that blew up my Christianity for all intents and purposes. And throughout that, I sort of, I'm infinitely curious. And so I had a kind of an academic journey that led me to, what we now refer to as deconstruction. We didn't have the language for it when I was 18, 30 years ago. But it caused me to ask a lot of questions. And then life experience, really, I had to interrogate my faith with lived experience. And that left me wondering a lot. So I eventually got into the study of comparative religions and the study of comparative mythology and Jungian psychology. And, these days I'm a certified grief and trauma counselor. I'm a certified spiritual director. I have my PhD and all those things that I just mentioned. But it's been a wild ride.
Wow.
And I've led a few spiritual communities. I've been a chaplain for a theater in Midtown Manhattan, yada, yada, yada. It's been a journey.
Thank you so much. Like, there's so much depth there. It feels like we could dissect every one of those experiences. I just keep thinking of Richard Rohr's line about great love and great suffering. It just feels like you were on this ride of like serious love and serious suffering, and I can't imagine the pain inside that story. So thank you so much for sharing. And
Yeah.
I'd actually, if it's okay, like I think maybe a a point where there's a real intersection with our audience is that I think a lot of people are at a crossroads that might feel similar, that something about their life has brought them to a place where their faith is starting to feel a little bit complicated. And I think a lot of our audience is in like the thick of their faith journey. And maybe for some people that feels expansive and joyful and curious, and it feels like you're being pulled forward by love. But I think there are probably a lot of people who are in the middle of that deconstruction that you talk about, where they're just experiencing, it feels just like loss after loss, loss of certainty, loss of belonging, loss of identity. And like, while whatever you're experiencing, like there may be pain in those experiences by themselves, but add this questioning your faith and having to re-examine what used to be an anchor for you, that can just be such an exquisite type of pain. So could you just talk to the people who are in that place, who are really wondering right now if something has gone terribly wrong, if maybe even they've done something terribly wrong that has brought them to this place?
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and then we'll go hard, right? So, the first of all, the psychology of it, right? When we go through life, we construct essentially an internal GPS system. Like we create maps to figure out how to function in the world. And I love the idea of a GPS because there are three big components to it, if I understand correctly. And that is our ideas about God, that's the G, our ideas about people, that's the P, and our ideas about ourself. And I think what most people don't understand, we have this beautiful language of construction, deconstruction, reconstruction, order, disorder, reorder. We have a system that's giving meaning to our life, and then suddenly something happens and we start to question it. What I think a lot of people don't realize is the meaning making matrix of your ideas about God, about people, and about self. They're so interconnected that if any one of them takes a hit, the other two suffer. So most people don't realize if I start to question my thoughts about God and religion, as a result, I'm going to have a crisis of self-esteem and I'm going to question my worldview. If I'm betrayed by
Wow.
folks in the spiritual community and it makes me rethink what I think about people, that's going to affect what I think about God and what I think about myself. Or if I let myself down and I have a crisis of self-esteem and self-identity, that is going to hit what I believe religiously and what I believe about the people around me. They're so interconnected. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it hurts so bad. Like it hurts to lose a guiding man. Like if you've ever been driving
Right.
and the GPS has been wrong, is there any worse sense of betrayal? I remember when I used to live in New York City, it was in the very early days of this, and very frequently the GPS would throw me the wrong way down a one-way street. And I'd be driving down, and there'd be like a garbage truck heading at me, honking and flashing its lights, and no way to go around it. And it was such a deep sense of betrayal. But that's sort of, what this feels like.
Yeah.
Um, the paradox is, Richard Rohr says this in his book, Falling Upward, which I think everyone should read, regardless of your spiritual persuasion or religious orientation. It's
Yes.
just such good wisdom about growing up, right? And he says, sooner or later, if we're on any kind of a classical spiritual schedule, at some point we are going to fail at something or something is going to fail us. And the paradox is a lot of folks will talk about this as sort of like losing their faith or going through a dark night of the soul. But we have the great spiritual teachings of the world's traditions that tell us this is actually part of not losing our spirituality, but growing deeper into it. Um, and it's something that almost all of our great spiritual guides have gone through. So while it's terrifying and lonely, we're not alone when we go through it. In some ways, we're never less alone than walking through this experience of loneliness. Um, yeah, that's a lot of words. I'll say one more thing though from the heart. The thing that's interesting about that too is I'm these days all I can think about is how our wounds and our experiences of wonder lead us to wisdom. And
Mm.
what's wild about these experiences where sort of our meaning making map gets blown up and we find ourselves as an uncharted territory is as terrifying as that is, it can also lead us open to new experiences of beauty and meaning. And so what I always say to people is when you're going through this, no matter how terrifying it is, don't forget to look for the new ways that beauty and meaning and wonder and I'll say God can break in. Anyway, that's a lot of words. I'll stop. Does any of that make sense?
Oh
That's
my
so good.
gosh. Yeah,
That's
that
so good.
resonates so much.
One thing that it's making me wonder if we could, I mean, if we go back to your story for a second, Aubrey, what is the phrase? Is it the deeper the trauma, the deeper the deconstruction? Is that what we sort of like were circling on a few months ago? Have
I
you ever
mean,
heard anything like that,
certainly
Mike?
like the deeper your misunderstanding of God, like the deeper
Yeah,
the brokenness around the concept,
yeah,
like the more you have to excavate.
yeah. And so I guess when I hear you describe the way that you grew up in your spiritual tradition, prosperity gospel, um, and how close that was to you and your family, coupled with these really, really traumatic experiences. I'm curious, when you sort of like look at its correlation with your deconstruction, did you have to go like all the way down deep, like everything is in question, or how did it actually work for you?
Man, that's a good question. Yes. Short answer, yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
Um, and every theory is a subjective confession. So what I'm saying is like, here's what I think is based on how I did it, right? So that's all
Yeah.
there is to it. I do think, look, a guiding motto for me is get deeper, go crazy. And I think that's the real, like when we face crisis, get deeper, go crazy. Those are your two options. I
Yeah.
prefer get deep personally.
Mm.
So yeah, the deeper the trauma and the deeper the loss, the deeper the deconstruction. The thing about trauma, though, if we're talking very literally about trauma, trauma precludes meaning making. Trauma lives in your
Mm.
brainstem and meaning making happens in your cerebral cortex. And trauma shuts down higher brain function to put you in a survival mode. And so another podcast episode, another day. I think one of the dangers that we can experience when we go through like a deep deconstruction is to try to rush too quickly to
Mm.
making sense of things. Most people's, do you know anything about the five stages of grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not exact science, but she posits that when we're going through grief, we go through, what was it? Denial,
Denial,
anger,
anger,
s-
Bargaining.
bargaining, sadness, or depression, and then finally acceptance.
acceptance.
Most people's like theological journey of deconstruction is really just the bargaining phase of grief. We're just trying on different theological ideas to try to make sense of something that ultimately defies being made sense of. Um, And we have to sort of get there experientially and emotionally first. And then we are gifted, I think, later with a meaning making narrative and with you know, whatever our new sort of
Yeah.
theology is. But yeah, for me it cut really deep. I think what saved me was exactly what I just described. Like there were experiences of beauty that broke through that I couldn't make sense of. So I told you this whole story of you know, losing so many folks in my family, losing my brother, um, and then having almost no time to prepare myself to lose my mom as the final loss in this devastating series of events. And I remember there was a day my mom was in the hospital non-responsive for about 3 weeks. I sat at her bedside as she sort of did died very quickly, considering how much time we had. And so there was one day where I was sitting next to her, um, in her, you know, she's in the hospital bed, and I'm sitting there right next to her, and I'm holding her hand, mostly non-responsive. She would like stir a little bit here and then open her eyes once in a while. And so I squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back. And I remember I said to myself, okay, that's not just a reflex. She knows that I'm here. And then her eyes opened a little bit, and I got in front of her to make eye contact, and I held her eyes. And I said to myself, she knows that it's me. She knows I'm her son. She knows that I love her, and she knows that I'm here. And then she like coughed or something, and a monitor next to her started to beep, and a nurse leaned over to make sure she was okay. And at exactly that moment, my sister walked over because she'd gotten a phone call, and my sister and I kissed my mom goodbye, jumped in a car, drove across town to another hospital, rode up the elevator. We're standing there in another hospital room. My brother's widow is there in the hospital bed holding this newborn baby because when my brother died, his wife was 3 months pregnant. And there is this tiny little child. And I put my finger in her tiny little hand, and her tiny little hand squeezed on my finger. And I remember saying, that's not just a reflex. She knows I'm her Uncle Mike and that I love her. And her tiny little eyes open. You know that like the eyes of a newborn child are just the most amazing thing you'll ever see in your entire life. And I like tried to get in there and make a little bit of eye contact. And once again, I was like holding her gaze, and I'm like, she's not just looking at a stranger. She knows it's me. She knows that I love her. And then she did something. I don't know. She did a baby thing. She sneezed or made a noise or something. And there was a nurse next to the bed, and she leaned over to make sure that she was okay. And at that moment, the symmetry of standing next to my mom as she was dying, holding her hand, looking in her eyes, like her coughing, the nurse being right there, being there with my newborn niece, finger in her hand, looking in her eyes. You know, she makes a little baby noise. The nurse checks on her. Something cracked me open, and I cannot explain it. It was one of the most mystical and wonder-filled moments of my life, happening in one of the most devastating seasons of deconstruction I could imagine myself or anyone going through. And so I share all that to say the deeper the trauma, the deeper the deconstruction, but the deeper the deconstruction, the deeper the possibility for divinity to break in and surprise you in ways that you wouldn't expect. And so I think my advice is like stay open and take the
Mm.
journey, and trust that you will come out the other side and it will be okay.
Oh my
Oh my
gosh.
gosh. That's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that story. Oh my gosh.
My pleasure.
Um, I'm thinking about this concept. We've learned a lot from you about origin.
Oh
And
yeah.
there's this concept that I'd love for you to talk about now. He talks about health bestowing wounds. And
Yeah,
I would love for you to, with all of this context, all of this life that you had been experiencing up to that point, how did all of this pain become a wound that actually nourished you? Like, how do you think about that now? And is there a way that our actual pain helps shape the work that we're called to do?
absolutely. I 100% believe that. So without getting too deep into the theology origins, he was born in 180, died in I think 230, something like that. He's a second, third century Christian mystic, um, controversial and also the best. Just so many good ideas. And he wrote the first great mystical commentary on the Song of Songs in Christianity. and he talked about it as a relationship between the soul and the divine, right? Um, Story for another day. We could talk about that for hours. But he does have this passage in there where he talks about health bestowing wounds. We are stricken with wounds that become health bestowing. The very thing that hurts you is the thing that heals you. Or at the very least, the pain that you can feel is the pain that you can heal. So I
Yeah.
am convinced that our wounds in life um, shape our lives. I'm working on a book right now called The Healer with a Thousand Faces. And this is the whole
Mm.
idea that I explore because it's become so real to me being gifted to interview so many brilliant spiritual teachers the last few years. Um, I think our wounds set us out on our wandering. They shape the life that we walk. And yours looks different than mine. And you know, everyone in our audience has a different path that their life has taken, but it has been shaped in part by our wounds. And then our wounds shape our wandering, but they shape our wondering. They give us the unique questions that are ours to ask and answer. There is a very
Mm.
particular set of questions. I can say more about this later if you want, but there's a very particular set of questions that I was handed by my parents, by my faith community, by life, you know, and those are my questions to ask. Um, but in asking those questions, my wounds lead me to my wisdom, and my wisdom is different than your wisdom. Origen talks about this. He says one person has a wound of knowledge, another person has a wound of wisdom. I think everyone has a particular yeah, a particular wisdom that's theirs to give. It's the medicine that they need, which they find for themselves, which in turn becomes the medicine that is theirs to give to the world. Or as one of our teachers, Carmen Acevedo Butcher, said to me once when I asked her about that, she said, well, we really become the medicine. And then our wounds shape our work after they give us our wisdom. So it's pretty great. You know, I mean, it is a painful process, but I think if you deeply commit to your own healing, at a certain point, you realize it's not just for you.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
I
that's just blowing my mind. I don't forget what you're going to say, Tim, but I just have to say, like, I feel like these are the conversations that we had over and over when Tim and I both started having like really big questions about our own faith tradition and our own actual, like literal actual beliefs. I think the scary question was like, are we only here because we were born here? And are we trying to undo these things that we were given? That was a scary thought. And I love the idea that maybe the pain or the discomfort that you're becoming aware of is yours to transmute. And like, it's not you being aware of all the things that you shouldn't have experienced. It's you being aware of what's yours to heal. Like that just completely turns that experience on its head in such an empowering way. So
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, and I absolutely like the question of are we only here because this was what we were born into? Yes. And also, does that change anything that this is probably our work to do and our walk to walk? No.
yeah.
That's what's so beautiful about it. Yeah, Tim, I know you had something to say, but you want to hear a Carl Jung quote about this before we move on?
Yes. Yes.
So Carl Jung, Swiss psychologist, famous wrestler with Christianity for his entire life, son of a preacher. So I relate to that. He writes, this is one of my guiding mantras. I feel very strongly that I am under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by my parents and grandparents and more distant ancestors. It often seems as if there were an impersonal karma within a family. And if karma doesn't work for you, he's just saying baggage gets handed down, which is passed on from parents to children. It has always seemed to me that I had to answer questions which fate had posed to my forefathers and which had not yet been answered, or if I had to complete or perhaps continue things which previous ages had left unfinished.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Well, yeah, that's
It's so
exactly it.
real.
That is
Yeah.
so interesting.
What I
Yeah.
what I was gonna ask is, I imagine, a lot of people listening to this are feeling very deeply their own wounds, right now. And it's not difficult for them to think, to hear this and like relate it to hear the wounding part of this conversation and relate it very easily to their own lives. I would imagine too that a large segment of that population is is hearing this and saying, okay, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. I could become the wounded healer. My wounds could be transmuted into a way to heal in some way, but I don't know how to get there. And I'm wondering, I guess the question is are we just getting pulled along in the stream and there's nothing to do other than sort of stay open and we will get there? Or is there something, if somebody like really wants to, start taking specific steps, like, or is it just a matter of waiting it out, letting time and God do their work, you know?
I mean, all of the above. I think the way you ask the question proves that you're in it, right? I think we all have our own particular way. I got lucky when I was sort of in my absolute despair of like not knowing what to believe in and feeling betrayed by nearly everything. I had developed this interest in Carl Jung, and I read in one of his biographies, they talk about Jung has this, he's very successful when he's young, and then he has a huge break with Sigmund Freud, who was one of the leading psychologists of the day, and he's professionally betrayed and his life blows up and he has a bit of a breakdown. It's a very serious breakdown. And one of his biographers said, Jung approached the whole experience with curiosity, saying like, well, I'm a psychologist and I'm having a psychic break. So now I can study this from the inside. And I think there was a part of me that, as silly as that sounds, I read that and I thought, all right, I am a spiritual seeker going through a spiritual crisis. And so like I'm gonna experience the whole thing. And when I come out the other side of it, I will be wiser than I was. Um, but that doesn't put a bow on it, right? That doesn't make it easy. I will say, listen to your wounds, listen to your wonder. Like go back to those two things constantly. I do genuinely believe that there is wisdom in the wound. Um, that's not to say that we are not let down. That's not to say that some of us won't end up feeling betrayed by ourselves, by friends, by family members, by spiritual systems, by religious leaders, where however it shakes down for you. But there is something when you can stay faithful to nothing else, stay faithful to the quest that is in the questions. Um, be honest about your personal experience, but stay open. Keep asking the questions and stay with it. And then, if you're lucky, they say when the student is ready to teach your peers, you look for good guides. I've stopped looking for people who give me answers that I want, and I've started looking for people who are giving me questions that I trust. Um, because I find the kindred spirits that I can journey with. I would add one more thing,
Yeah.
just in the sense of like the loss component too, because like we're talking about losing ideas and community and meaning making systems, and that really is a very genuine trauma, and that's if you ever feel bad about feeling bad about that, don't. One of the most serious losses we can experience. But then also the losses of like legitimately losing family members, losing relationships, and then having people die. That those losses are real as well. And I would just add, I worked with a really good spiritual director when I went through my deconstruction. We worked together for 13 years. So that's another thing. Don't do it alone if you don't have to. Find good friends,
Yeah.
find a good director, find a mentor if you can. Um, find a good podcast and listen to it faithfully. Journal, talk to yourself when nothing else fails. Talk to God if you still can. But I had the very first time I started working with my spiritual director, she sort of was like, "Why are you here?" And I was like, "I'm here because I need to reconstruct meaning-making systems, and I'm a former Christian, and I'm into Buddhism, and I'm into Jungian stuff, and I don't know what to do with all of it." And she let me talk about that for about an hour. A lot of really good ideas. And then she said to me, "That's not why you're here." And I said, "Okay, well, you tell me, oh wise one, why am I here?" And she said, "You just want to know why you've had so much loss in your life." And I started to tell her she was wrong. And then I realized I was crying. So I was like, "Oh, I'm crying. Maybe you're right." And then
Wow.
before I could say anything, I blurted out and I said, "Do you ever come back from this?" And she said to me, um, "Yes." She said, "You do." And she said, "My experience has been that the people who suffer loss carves out a giant space in your heart. And what that big empty space does is it gives you more capacity to hold the sadness of others." So she said, "You will be quick to tears for the rest of your life, and you will feel the sadness of the world and the people around you more readily for the rest of your life. But the good news is that empty space also holds joy, and love and meaning, and you will be more quick to see beauty and to feel love and joy. And you will probably be quicker to laughter for the rest of your life. Because she said, my experience has been the folks I know who've suffered the most and come through it are the quickest to a smile and the quickest to a laugh without being naive about the suffering of the world. And I will say, like, that's been my experience. So, like, all that to say, trust the empty space that is being carved out in your mind and your heart.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I want to go back to that point about curiosity because that feels really good to me. Like that feels like such good energy. It feels like it's this it feels like the opposite of shame, actually. It feels like it's sunlight, it's open, it's growth, it's expansion. It's the opposite of that shrinking, fearful, shameful feeling. But I wonder if, and I remember hearing you say once that you said, I think it was in an interview, you said that questions are the beating heart of your spirituality. And that just lit me up because that's been my experience and I'm not even sure I can explain why, but there is something about digging for the deepest question and asking it honestly that is like that alone is this experience of having fear transmuted into something more peaceful, even though you're not necessarily coming by an answer. It's just there is something about that experience, like that kind of honesty with yourself or God or your people. I don't know. But I wonder, I think sometimes we can bump up into expectations about curiosity that there should be some sort of boundaries or limits and that there's curiosity that can be dangerous. And I think in our community, sometimes people differentiate between questioning and doubting. And I know I'm sure there are a handful of other words, but it's this feeling of like, you need to be careful sometimes, like sometimes curiosity goes too far and it becomes detrimental to your faith. So I'd love for you to take that on. Like I guess, why is it such a nourishing part of your faith life?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll take a stab at this and then just redirect me if I'm missing it. First of all, I do want to say, like, look, I have this cat who's been on and off the screen the whole time that we've been talking, and there's that old adage that curiosity killed the cat.
Yeah.
He is infinitely curious, and I occasionally find like scrapes and bruises and bumps on him, and I'm like, I don't know how that happened. He got into some kind of an adventure. Um, and I feel that too. Like our curiosity will sometimes take us down dangerous alleyways. And yet, so again, Origen's my great spiritual teacher. He talks about in his great first work on theology, he talks about curiosity as something that's implanted in our heart by God. So his theology is we are created for curiosity because that curiosity leads us to seek God in everything and everyone around us. Theologically speaking, that's a cool universe. That's the universe that I want to live in. Um, I think we are infinite capacities for curiosity. And I think curiosity is an expression of love. Like when you really love someone,
Mm.
like two of you love each other, like you want to stay curious about the person you love forever. You always want to know them and let them be a mystery because that curiosity is always inviting you deeper. And I think curiosity is the language of falling in love with reality. And I think it is a daily return to an openness to let the divine meet us, right? So there's that. Um, and then also I think that curiosity for me is a really, really good antidote to cynicism and skepticism. Because
Mm.
they're really, really similar, right? I always say, like, I can't take a spiritual teacher if they're too self-serious, but sort of folks who, my favorite spiritual teachers are the ones who will occasionally remind me not to take it too seriously. Or sometimes be like, I don't know, maybe we're wrong. I had a spiritual teacher who one time who said a really good clergy person is an atheist 2 days a week, but they meant that in a good way, not in a bad way.
Yeah.
Our curiosity keeps us flexible and it
Mm.
allows for growth. Um, the and I think I want to think of I do want to answer your question. I want to think about the dangerous parts of curiosity. I think curiosity scares folks sometimes because um it can feel like taking apart some of our best spiritual truths and spiritual teachings and spiritual institutions. But to those folks, I always say, hey, if you really believe in this, don't you have the faith that if we're asking curious questions, we're going to find truth anyway? Like, have a little faith.
Yeah.
It- you
Yeah.
know, in my own inherited faith tradition, I'm like, Jesus can take it. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure God can take my questions. I actually, when I read the Christian scriptures, what I see from the book of Genesis to the book of Job to Jesus and his disciples to the epistles is a constant inviting of questions. Um, yeah, but I don't know if I've
Yeah.
answered your question or not, so feel free
Yeah.
to.
No,
Yeah.
that's it exactly. Yeah. And
Yeah,
I
I
like
think
the idea that like there's this, it's an orientation. So even if you get to what feels like a dead end, like you're going to be curious about that. Like it's not that it's an orientation of cynicism. It's an orientation that will always keep you moving, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. I
Yeah.
think oh, go ahead, Mike. Were you gonna say something?
No, after you. I won't lose
I
it.
well, I think the reason I mean, yeah, the it might be helpful for me to go even a little bit deeper here is that so like that resonates so profoundly with my own spirituality. And, I felt like I got really, really stopped up um, when I had a limit to my curiosity. And and at one point, I had to sort of like break through that and allow for my questions and curiosity and even doubts to sort of like truly come out and express themselves fully. And that's when I feel like I like continued on the spiritual path after having been when I didn't allow that, it really felt like there was a stagnation for a while. And now in the place that I'm in, where my own curiosity, my own uncertainty at times is such a huge part of it, it feels really, rich and fulfilling and open. And and like I would say my relationship to the divine is maybe less certain than it's been, but it's also deeper than it's been in some way, which maybe is a paradox. But when I think about like, if you think about the symbol of the cross, you've got this vertical connection to the divine, and then you've got horizontal connection to other people. I feel like at times my uncertainty and curiosity, while it's been that root of my deeper connection to the divine, the horizontal connection can be the hard part. If you want to stay in deep relationship with people who are not necessarily open to questions, it can be really hard. And I think a lot of people who are in this place end up just avoiding these conversations, or if they do come out, they can be scary and explosive, and it can be a very tough tightrope walk if you want to go deep with people and they're coming from this really different perspective where curiosity isn't such a value.
Well, I would say two things. Like one, just to hammer the point home a little longer. Like I think about the two of you and your relationship with each other. Like it's got to be so great to know each other well and to feel seen and known. And yet, it is constricting when you think you have the other person completely figured out, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. There's a gift in letting someone be a continually evolving mystery.
Mm,
Um, a known mystery, right? The,
Yeah.
the the beauty between familiarity and mystery is a gift. And why would we not give that to God, first of all?
Yeah.
Who is, pretty big last time I checked. Um, and relatively mysterious. The other thing though is I will be honest about this. Like um I don't inflict my questions on those who can't handle them.
Yeah.
I don't, if this means anything to anyone listening, I'm a big Enneagram 4, so authenticity is a huge part of how I move in the world.
yeah.
But I've also become a lot more gentle with, Jung talks about not, if someone has a mythology, if they have a meaning-making system, if they have a belief that is serving them well, and this is the important part, it's not hurting other people, you
Yeah.
know, to an unmanageable degree. It is not our job to divest them of that. Life does that on its own. It's really good at it. And so what I've been, what I've worked my own journey on is the balance between authenticity and not imposing my questions on others who can't handle them. Now, if you're going through a crisis of faith or a deconstruction or an exploration, and let's be willing to talk about deconstruction sometimes as a deepening, right?
Mm,
A deepening of exploration and experience,
yeah.
a deepening of curiosity, and your partner, spouse is not going through that. I understand those are very, very challenging moments to navigate. But I think when you listen deeply, and here's the thing, when you are very in touch with your own honest questions, you will know what they sound like and you will hear them in the mouths of other people with whom you can have those conversations. So, if nothing else, staying in touch with your own questions helps you find the conversation partners that can go there with you. And it's very special when it happens. And don't force someone else to be that if they're not ready, you know? It's only going to make both of you miserable.
Yeah,
This is
that's
so
such
true.
good advice.
It really is. Yeah. Do you feel like this is that's part of the role of community, just like being in spaces where you have a shared canon and you have some amount of a shared experience? I really loved when at the very beginning of the Living School there was kind of this guiding principle that was articulated and that has stayed with me. Like I think about this all the time. That and I don't remember who, if it was Jim Finley maybe, I don't remember who said this, but the idea was that the more that you're listened to without being invaded or abandoned, the more you heal. And the more you heal, the more you become a healing presence in the world. And that has just been such a gift. Like turns out it's not about it's not about agreeing with each other. There's just something really beautiful that happens when you can be witnessed or when you can witness someone else. And so I'm just curious if you like, is that why we need community? Do we need community? Like is there something that community offers that we can't get all by ourselves?
I think so. My personal bias is yes. You know, look, I think in a post enlightenment Western culture, which we're all living in, regardless of, I'm guessing everyone who's listening to this podcast is living in some expression. We've sometimes been programmed to believe the community is formed around uniformity of belief system. And that is just not true. You don't have to agree with someone's beliefs to be in community because the truth is no two people have exactly the same set of beliefs. Community can be a place where you learn to be in conversation together while having different questions and different curiosities. You know, a community can be a place where we learn we get curious about why someone believes differently than we do. Um, I do think there's a point in our spiritual maturity where we stop looking for any one community to be the one-stop shop to meet all of our spiritual needs, right? Where I'm like, I'm going to go to church or temple, and that place is going to tell me what to believe, where to serve, who my friends are, blah, 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 blah. Like,
Mhm.
I don't think any religious system wants to be all those things for you because it's too many, right? And so like realizing that every community, the capital C community that surrounds the entirety of your life is always a home brew, right? It's a little bit of this, it's a little bit of that. It's each unique person has different needs. But I just don't think we can do it alone. I really don't. Jung says you can't individuate on top of Mount Everest. With all due respect to like mystics and monks who go off on their own, we need each other. We need conversation in my particular belief system. Conversation is the carrier and expressor of curiosity. So, yeah, and a little bit of disagreement when it's not disrespectful and toxic is actually really, really healthy and helpful.
Yeah.
I
This makes
love that.
me, so this brings up for me a question that's been very present for me for the past few weeks. And that is sort of trying to figure out the somewhat tricky balance between finding both community and canon and other, content or texts that resonate deeply with you and you find comfort in and that seem to heal you in some ways, and the other side of the coin, which is like community and texts uh and various other things that scandalize you. I think the word that we've heard you use is scandalon or scandala. I don't know how to pronounce this, but like these things that like are stumbling blocks.
Yeah.
And for a long time for me, going to church, in our home spiritual tradition was very, very painful, and everything I heard, I was trying not to roll my eyes or trying not to like sort of like boil over inside. And yet that sort of like tension felt like a necessary part of my growth, but I also needed something else. I needed something that was going to deeply resonate with me. So
Yeah.
I don't know, how do you approach that balance?
I think you nailed it. Like you need the both and, right?
Okay.
So, because again, I remember there's seasons of my life where I'd sit in church and I'd look like I was faithfully taking notes, and really all I was doing was journaling about how wrong the preacher was. And also now yeah. I also, if any of my teachers ever hear this, I don't want them to think that if I'm taking they don't know what they're talking about. Um, but you nailed it. So Origin has this really helpful principle. It's been so life-giving to me. So Origin is by scholars referred to as the father of Christian theology, the father of Christian mysticism, and the father of Christian biblical interpretation. Relatively important person in history. When he talked about how to read the Bible, his great claim to fame was he was the first great teacher of more than literal reading of scripture. I wouldn't say
Mm.
non-literal. I'd say more than literal because he did acknowledge a literal reading of scripture and then he would go past it. And so he talked about how when we would read scripture, there would be things he said the scripture had intentionally put stumbling blocks, hindrances, moral offenses, historical impossibilities where you'd read it and go, I'm sorry, that can't be right. Or how am I supposed to believe that a God of love would ask his people to murder these people and so on and so forth? And Origen says, when that happens, you'd be like, all right, I want to throw the scripture away. Don't throw the scripture away. That's actually scripture doing its job. The translation that we translate in English as stumbling block is the word scandala, scandalon. And the real easy way to go is it's the things that scandalize us. The job is ask us to think differently and more deeply. And so Origen's mantra was never be satisfied with a meaning that is not worthy of God, right? And my subtext would be not worthy of the God of love. But when something scandalizes you, it's doing its job to make you think more deeply and to wrestle with it and to push for a deeper meaning. So when I got that about scripture, and then I realized at a certain point, Origen said that we're always writing the books of the soul and the pages of our heart, and we are essentially living scripture. It occurred to me that that is true of everything in our life. Sometimes the very things that scandalize us in our sacred texts, in our spiritual leaders, in our life circumstances can be invitations to think more deeply and look for a more worthy meaning. And so, yes, we need spiritual community and we need spiritual texts that comfort us. And we also need spiritual community and we need spiritual texts that challenge us. We need the challenge to push us more deeply. Again, this whole notion of I'm deconstructing, I'm losing my faith, I'm all this, it's like, you might actually be moving to a more honest and more spiritual place. And that's really good for you. However, don't gaslight yourself in the process, right? Don't go too far. Don't punish yourself. Don't stay in a toxic situation um, that is going to do, permanent harm in the long run. So I
Yeah.
apologize if that sounds like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but it kind of is. It's a both
Mm.
and.
Yeah.
But again, my 2 cents is always look for the things that scandalize you as an invitation to deeper meaning.
I love that. How do you check yourself though? Because it feels like that might leave the door open to just reading scripture in a way that is always in the service of your ego or in the service of whatever your bias already is. And, is there a way to always keep that in check?
Yeah. When you are deconstructing, the number one thing you should be questioning is yourself. Um, because, and again, I've already said this, like a deconstruction can very often cause a crisis of self-identity and self-esteem. And sometimes we don't acknowledge that, and that's where it can be harmful. And that's why therapy is great and spiritual direction is great. Good friends are great. Um, but it's always an invitation to curiosity and bigger possibilities, right? We go through the world, we create a meaning-making system that's supposed to help us navigate. And then the vehicle of exploration becomes a prison of isolation when instead of something that helps us navigate the world, it becomes a prison of secure beliefs. And then life or God is kind enough to shatter us upon the rocks of irreconcilable paradox and throw us into situations that are bigger than our maps. And what that does is it always opens us up to new possibility. And hopefully, if we take the journey and we're honest, the number one skill that we learn is to stay open to possibility. It looks so much like being skeptical and suspicious, but it's actually very, very different. It's staying open. And so you nailed it. Like that can become a very arrogant, egotistical, self-righteous thought that I just know better and I'm critiquing everything. That's the
Yeah.
danger of narcissism. The other danger is nihilism, where you're like, well, no one can know anything, so what's it matter? And well, that's just boring, and who wants to live in that universe? And you know, that middle path is humility. It's humility. It's which really literally translates as being grounded. So if nothing else, Richard Rohr, a beloved teacher, founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation, just released a new book called The Tears of Things. And he talks about what he calls the path of the prophet. He says when we encounter injustice, our first reaction is very often anger. And then if we stay with that anger, what we realize is underneath that anger is sadness. And underneath that sadness is love. If you're angry, it's because something you love is threatened or on the line, and there's sadness there. I will tell you the same thing is true for inconsistency when we're deconstructing. When we hit things that don't make sense, it's very normal for anger to be our first reaction. And that's also part of the grieving process because we're losing something. And if we stay with the anger and we get past the denial and we let go when the time is right of the bargaining of trying to find an answer that's going to make it all sense, eventually we'll get to sadness. And if we get past the sadness, what we find is love, which is also acceptance. All that to say, when you are going through this, try and try and try again to find your way past anger into the sadness and the love, and that will probably keep us from reinforcing our ego.
Ooh,
All right,
so
it's a
good.
lot of work. There you go.
Wow.
The
Yeah.
way that I've been thinking about this lately is, well, Brian McLaren's stages has become such useful language for us. I know there's so many different models, but the framework that he has of simplicity, complexity, perplexity, harmony has
Yeah.
seemed, for whatever reason, just it seems so easy to integrate into the way we talk about our journeys. And the way that I've been thinking about this lately is that perplexity is has been for me such a necessary stage. And when I first, I think, entered into perplexity, that the questioning everything, the skepticism, at times cynicism, was focused on external factors. It was questioning institutions, traditions, texts, all of that, with sort of this view that I know better, or potentially like I don't know and neither do you type of mentality, and eventually, and I think that's like early stage perplexity, and I've seen this repeated a couple in a couple of close friends as well, where it seems then to like lead into a later stage perplexity where you focus it inward and you start to question your own biases and your own prejudices and wonder if maybe even the things that maybe you should even doubt the doubt that you have, you sort of like come full circle. And that I think can start to be a path into harmony, but I think
Yeah.
it has followed that pattern, at least for me.
100%. I mean, doubting your doubt is great. It can be crazy making if you take it too far, but also it can be just, it's the seedbed of curiosity in the best way. And gosh, there is something about, Jung says that everything that frustrates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, right? When we deconstruct, eventually what we deconstruct is ourselves, right? And that can be grounds for chaos and craziness, or it can be grounds for deep compassion. Um, and if like I'm a part of a religious system that's, you know, limited or broken, I'll talk about my own background and sort of the prosperity gospel, right? This idea that if I just pray hard enough, everything's going to be okay. And then I start to learn, I mean, maybe not. Um, my challenges with that system, um, when I realize, how do I say this? I used to think that you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And that was how I would decide like when to leave a spiritual community or what to do. I'm realizing these days, when you realize you're a part of the problem, you can then be a part of the solution. And so I have become a lot more compassionate for the folks and the systems that I've deconstructed, that I started out in, even the worst parts of it. Like to turn around and look at that system and be like, my God, why wouldn't we want to believe that we can be protected and and blessed and all these things? And also how heartbreaking to find that that may not be real. And how many other people are silently suffering and experiencing the same things and wrestling with the same questions. And I'm so busy being angry at the system that I'm not letting my heart be broken enough to meet those other folks where they're at. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but
Yeah.
yeah.
No, yes, so much. Like that's always the rest of the story. And I know I have felt that where like anger is so front and center that I can't even see the broken hearts. And I think that's probably what's really there. Like that's where the energy is actually coming from, but it's so easy to, it feels like a relief to have something to feel angry at. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate that reminder that like there is something heartbreaking happening that is fueling this feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, and to take it back to that like scandalon, being scandalized, like that's strong language. That doesn't make it easy. Like that fury of anger makes sense and is needed, correct? Because anger is fuel to make change. So we
Yeah.
need it at a certain point, but it's also insustainable. It'll burn us up.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hear you there too.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Mike. We could keep you all day. There's so much in here. I really can't tell you how much we appreciate this conversation. As we wrap up though, is there something that feels unsaid that you want to make sure you have a chance to talk about in this context, like a faith crisis and
Yeah.
deconstruction and curiosity? Like, what do you want people to know?
I mean, this has been great. Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. I think I would go out on the note that um you know, I I look all around the world and I see people in all different religions and denominations and spiritual systems right now collectively going through these massive moments of deconstruction. Something is happening um, worldwide. And while we can feel alone in it, we are not. One of our teachers, Dr. Barbara Holmes, who passed away a few months ago, always used to say it's a crowded path, the path of descent. Like the path to deconstruction is very crowded right now. And so the first thing is to remember that we're not alone. And the second thing is to remember that no matter where you land on the other side of it, no matter where you land, we always have the opportunity to put our healing in the service of healing the world. And like, to anyone listening, wherever you're going to come out spiritually, religiously, community wise, you are feeling a pain right now that you can help heal on the other side of it. And why not? Why not approach it that way as something that will inform the work that's yours to do in the world?
Wow.
What I got.
Mike, thank you. Thank you so much. I'll just say one more time, and I know I laid it on a little thick at the beginning, but it was sincere. And this conversation and the way you approach these questions, for me, it falls very much on the side of that type of content that is really healing for me. And very much the voice that you bring to this represents actually in a very real way what I hope for this podcast to be. And it's just really, really an honor to have you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the good work that you're doing in the world. I'm glad it's conversations like this that are guiding us into curiosity and they're life-saving. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Mike.
Okay, thank you so much for listening, and we want to send a huge thanks to Mike for coming on. And for those of you who might have been wondering more about the Living School, the Essentials of Engaged Contemplation course that Aubrey and I participated in is not currently open for enrollment, but if you're interested in learning more or getting updates, you can head to cac.org. And if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get a chance, we would love for you to leave a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We love reading reviews, and they definitely help get the word out about Faith Matters. Thanks again for listening, and as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.